In 1941, the largest warship the Royal Navy had ever built was torn apart in under 3 minutes. More than 1,400 men were on board. Only 3 survived. This is the story of HMS Hood, the ship that carried the pride of an entire empire on its deck, and how a single shell brought it all crashing down. Before we get into how she was destroyed, you need to understand what HMS Hood actually was. This was not just another battleship. She was a symbol. When Hood launched in 1918, she was the biggest warship on the planet. She was 860 feet long, displacing 42,000 tons, and armed with 8 15-inch guns that could hurl shells weighing nearly a ton over distances of more than 15 miles. Nothing else on the water came close. But Hood was more than raw firepower. She was beautiful. Her long, sweeping lines gave her an elegance that most warships never had. Sailors called her the Mighty Hood. The press loved her. The public adored her. Throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, she toured the world as a floating ambassador of British power. She visited ports across every ocean, and wherever she went, crowds gathered just to see her. She was the face of the Royal Navy during a time when the Royal Navy was still the most powerful fleet on Earth. And that reputation mattered. When you are the symbol of your nation's strength, the pressure to live up to that image is enormous. Hood carried that weight every single day. Now here is where the story starts to turn. Hood was designed during the First World War, and her design reflected the lessons of that era. She was classified as a battle cruiser, which meant she prioritized speed over protection. She could make over 30 knots, which was fast for a ship of her size. But to achieve that speed, her designers made compromises. Her armor was thinner than a true battleship's, especially on her deck, and that would prove to be a fatal weakness. By the late 1930s, the Admiralty knew Hood had problems. Her deck armor was not thick enough to protect against plunging fire, the kind of long-range shell fire that drops down at steep angles. Plans were drawn up for a major refit that would add extra armor and modernize her systems. But then the Second World War broke out, and there was no time. Hood was needed immediately. She went to war with the same thin deck armor she had carried since 1920. Think about that for a moment. The most famous warship in the Royal Navy entered the most dangerous naval conflict in history with armor that her own admirals knew was insufficient. The clock was already ticking. For the first 2 years of the war, Hood served hard. She patrolled the Atlantic, hunted enemy raiders, and even took part in the controversial attack on the French fleet at Mers el-Kebir in 1940. That action alone showed how seriously the British took naval power. They fired on their own former allies to prevent warships from falling into German hands. Hood was right in the middle of it. But by May 1941, a new threat had emerged. The German battleship Bismarck, one of the most powerful warships ever built, had broken out into the Atlantic. Bismarck was a monster. She was over 50,000 tons fully loaded, armed with 8 15-inch guns of her own, and wrapped in thick, modern armor that Hood simply did not have. If Bismarck reached the open Atlantic, she could devastate the convoys that were keeping Britain alive. Finding and stopping her became the single most urgent mission of the entire Royal Navy. Hood was chosen to lead the intercept. She sailed alongside the brand new battleship Prince of Wales, which was so fresh from the shipyard that civilian workers were still on board finishing her systems. Together, they steered northwest, toward the Denmark Strait, the narrow passage between Iceland and Greenland where Bismarck was expected to pass. On the morning of May 24th, 1941, they found her. The British ships spotted Bismarck and her escort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, in the cold gray waters of the strait. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding from Hood's bridge, ordered his ships to close the distance fast. He knew Hood was vulnerable at long range, where enemy shells would arc high and plunge down onto her weak deck armor. His plan was to get in close, where shells fly on a flatter trajectory, and Hood's side armor could actually do its job. It was a sound plan, but it required time, and Bismarck did not give them enough. The engagement opened at a range of roughly 26,000 yards. Hood fired first, but her initial salvos were aimed at the wrong ship. She targeted Prince Eugen, mistaking her for Bismarck, and precious moments were lost before the error was corrected. Meanwhile, Bismarck's gunners found their mark with terrifying speed. If you are enjoying this deep dive into one of the most dramatic naval battles in history, take a moment to subscribe and hit the notification bell. That way you will not miss any of our future stories about the ships, battles, and turning points that shape the modern world. It really helps the channel grow, and we have a lot more coming. Now, back to the battle. Within minutes, Bismarck's fifth salvo struck Hood. One or more shells penetrated deep into the ship, likely reaching the aft magazines where ammunition for the main guns was stored. What happened next was catastrophic. A massive explosion erupted from Hood's midsection. Eyewitnesses on Prince of Wales and on the escorting destroyers described a column of flame that shot hundreds of feet into the sky. The blast was so violent that it broke Hood's back. The mighty ship, all 860 feet of her, split in two. The bow rose up out of the water at a sickening angle, hung there for a moment, and then slid beneath the waves. The stern had already disappeared. From the first hit to the moment, Hood vanished. Fewer than 3 minutes had passed. Of the 1,418 men aboard, only 3 survived. 3. Ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, able seaman Robert Tilburn, and midshipman William Dundas were plucked from the freezing water by the destroyer Electra. Everyone else was gone. The shock that hit Britain when the news broke is hard to overstate. Hood was not just a warship. She was a national icon. Entire generations had grown up seeing her in newsreels and newspapers. Losing her felt like losing something fundamental about Britain itself. Winston Churchill reportedly received the news with just 2 words: "Sink the Bismarck." And the Royal Navy did exactly that, hunting Bismarck across the Atlantic and sending her to the bottom 3 days later. But that victory could never undo what had happened to Hood. So, what actually caused the explosion? The precise sequence has been debated for decades. The official inquiry concluded that a shell from Bismarck penetrated Hood's deck armor and detonated in or near the aft 4-inch magazine, which then triggered a catastrophic chain reaction that reached the main 15-inch magazines. The thin deck armor, the very weakness the Admiralty had known about for years, was almost certainly the primary cause. Some researchers have proposed alternative theories, including the possibility that a fire on deck reached ready-use ammunition lockers and worked its way down into the ship. Others have suggested a torpedo warhead storage area was involved. But the most widely accepted explanation remains the simplest one. A heavy shell punched through armor that was never thick enough, and it found the worst possible place to land. In 2001, An expedition led by David Mearns located Hood's wreck on the seabed of the Denmark Strait, lying in approximately 2,800 meters of water. The wreck confirmed the violence of the explosion. The ship's hull was shattered, with debris spread across a wide area of the ocean floor. The site is designated as a war grave, and it remains protected to this day. Hood's loss changed the way the Royal Navy thought about ship design and battle tactics. It reinforced the lesson that speed, without adequate protection, is a deadly gamble. It showed that even the most famous and beloved warship is only as strong as its weakest point. And it reminded an entire nation that symbols, no matter how powerful they seem, are still made of steel and crewed by mortal men. The 3 survivors carried the memory of that morning for the rest of their lives. Ted Briggs, the last of them, passed away in 2008. He spent decades attending memorials and speaking about his shipmates, making sure the world never forgot the 1,415 men who did not come home. HMS Hood was more than a warship. She was the pride of the Royal Navy, a symbol of an empire's strength and, ultimately, a lesson written in fire and seawater. She reminds us that no ship is unsinkable, no reputation is unbreakable, and the cost of war is always measured in human lives. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, leave a comment and let us know. We will see you in the next one.